George Harrison was called the quiet Beatle, the one who preferred guitars to arguments, meditation to madness. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney fought for headlines and songwriting supremacy, George seemed to drift somewhere else, absorbed in his own world of music and spirituality. At least, that's the image the public believed. But behind the stillness, something darker lived. A resentment that grew year by year, until it hardened into a grudge he never truly let go of. He wasn't the type to shout, but when he finally did speak, the words shocked even those closest to him. Because George Harrison, gentle, thoughtful, spiritual George, confessed that there was one man he truly hated. Was it Paul McCartney, the bandmate who constantly overshadowed his songs? Was it John Lennon, the friend-turned-rival who dismissed his music and mocked his beliefs? Or was it someone even more unexpected, hiding in plain sight inside the Beatles' inner circle? This is the story of the one person George Harrison could never forgive. By the late 1950s, Liverpool was alive with the sound of skiffle. Cheap guitars and homemade instruments gave young working-class kids a chance to dream beyond factory jobs and coal yards. George Harrison, barely a teenager, was one of them. He had already formed a small group called the Rebels with his brother Peter and friend Arthur Kelly. They weren't famous, but they were serious enough to fill George with confidence. Every night he worked his fingers raw on that battered guitar his mother had bought for him. Music wasn't just an escape anymore, it was his future. That future arrived in March 1958. Paul McCartney, the school friend who had bonded with George over guitar chords on the bus, invited him to audition for John Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen. George was only 15, younger than the rest, and at first Lennon wasn't convinced. He thought George looked like a child, not a bandmate. But Paul persisted. He arranged another meeting, this time on the upper deck of a Liverpool bus, where George played a lead guitar solo so sharp it made Lennon stop doubting. With that, George Harrison joined the Quarrymen. Even then, life pulled him in two directions. His father wanted him to pursue a trade. George briefly apprenticed as an electrician at Blackler's department store. But wiring circuits couldn't compete with the thrill of making music. By 16 he had left school behind, determined to give himself fully to the Quarrymen. It was a gamble. No one could predict that this group of scrappy Liverpool kids would become the most famous band on earth. The Quarrymen soon transformed into the Beatles, taking their first shaky steps on the path to stardom. Under early manager Alan Williams, they landed gigs in Hamburg, Germany, where long nights in rough clubs hardened their skills. These residencies were grueling, 7 hours a night, fueled by caffeine pills, sweat, and adrenaline. For George it was both exhilarating and dangerous. He was still underage, just 17, and German authorities eventually deported him for being too young to legally work in nightclubs. That abrupt ending might have broken a weaker spirit, but George returned to Liverpool more determined than ever. By December 1961, fate intervened again. Brian Epstein, a sharp-dressed record store owner with ambitions far bigger than his shop counter, became their manager. Epstein polished the Beatles' image, cleaning up their scruffy stage look and pushing them toward a recording contract. George, with his brooding good looks and sharp guitar, fit the image perfectly. Even if he didn't crave the spotlight like John or Paul, he brought balance to the group. His steady presence became an anchor as they stepped into a world of screaming fans and dizzying fame. Their first single, Love Me Do, cracked the British charts in late 1962. Within months, Beatlemania was sweeping across the United Kingdom. For George, the rise was almost surreal. Just a few years earlier, he had been doodling guitars in school notebooks and tinkering with skiffle groups. Now he was performing on stages where thousands of fans screamed his name. Yet even in these early days, a pattern began to emerge. While John and Paul dominated songwriting and interviews, George's quieter voice was often overlooked. Still, George carved out his place. His guitar work gave the Beatles a distinct edge, sharper and more soulful than many of their rivals. And though he rarely pushed himself forward, those who looked closely could already see the seeds of his frustration. He wanted to write. He wanted to be heard. But in a band with two unstoppable frontmen, George was forced to bide his time. The boy who had once been too young for John Lennon's approval was now part of the world's most exciting group. Yet even in the glow of early success, the quiet Beatle was already wrestling with a question that would haunt him for years. Would he ever be more than just the third man in the world's most famous songwriting team? As the Beatles exploded into global stardom, each member was quickly assigned an identity by the press. John Lennon was the witty rebel, Paul McCartney was the charming romantic, Ringo Starr was the lovable everyman, and George Harrison, he was dubbed the quiet Beatle. On the surface the title fit. He spoke less in interviews, avoided flamboyant gestures, and often let the others dominate the spotlight. Yet the label became a trap. Beneath the calm exterior, George was restless. He didn't want to just stand in the shadows. He wanted to prove he had something of his own to say. The first real glimpse of George's voice came on with the Beatles in 1963. Tucked among Lennon-McCartney tracks was Don't Bother Me, the first song Harrison ever wrote. It wasn't a love ballad or a pop anthem. It was darker, moodier, reflecting George's more introspective nature. Fans were surprised. Critics didn't know what to make of it. But to George, it was validation. He could write. He could tell his own story, even if the world wasn't ready for it yet. At the same time, George's role as the Beatles' musical scout was beginning to show its influence. He was always the one digging through American imports, listening to soul records, and pushing the band toward new sounds. By the mid-60s, this curiosity opened the door to something revolutionary. George discovered Indian classical music, and it changed everything. His introduction of the sitar on Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown in 1965 marked a turning point not only for the Beatles, but for Western pop music as a whole. Suddenly, Indian instruments and philosophies were entering mainstream culture, and George was the gateway. His fascination wasn't a gimmick. He immersed himself in it, studying under sitar master Ravi Shankar, learning the discipline and spirituality behind the music. Where John and Paul chased fame and chart toppers, George chased meaning. His friends would later say that his search for truth was as relentless as his guitar practice in those teenage years. To George, music was more than entertainment. It was a path toward something higher. By the time Revolver arrived in 1966, George's songwriting had matured dramatically. The album opened with his biting political track Taxman, proof that he could channel wit and anger just as sharply as Lennon. He added Love You To, drenched in Indian instrumentation, and I Want to Tell You, which revealed his knack for melody. Suddenly, George wasn't just filling space on Beatles records, he was expanding the entire band's horizon. Critics began to notice. Fans began to ask, was George Harrison finally stepping out from under John and Paul's shadow? Yet, with every step forward, came frustration. The Beatles' system was still designed around Lennon-McCartney dominance. George could bring in 2 or 3 songs per album at most, no matter how strong they were. He watched as John and Paul released song after song while his compositions piled up in notebooks, unheard. In later years he would admit that this imbalance wore him down. He was growing fast as a songwriter, but the recognition wasn't coming fast enough. Ironically, it was this tension that gave George some of his greatest work. The constant fight to be heard forced him to refine every lyric, every chord progression. When he finally broke through with classics like Here Comes the Sun and Something, those songs carried the weight of years of struggle. They weren't casual hits. They were statements. Proof that the quiet Beatle had a voice every bit as powerful as his bandmates. But in the mid-60s, that breakthrough was still on the horizon. For now, George continued to wrestle with his place in a band where brilliance sometimes came at the expense of balance. He was the quiet Beatle to the world. Inside, he was anything but. He was building a voice that could no longer be ignored. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were no longer the fresh-faced band from Liverpool. They were icons, each album pushing music into uncharted territory. But behind the scenes, cracks were widening. For George Harrison, those cracks came from years of feeling overshadowed. He had grown into a songwriter of extraordinary depth, yet Lennon and McCartney still dominated the records. George wasn't content to be the third wheel anymore, and by Abbey Road, his frustration was impossible to ignore. The shift began during the Revolver sessions in 1966. George had already contributed Taxman, one of the band's most biting tracks, and his experimentation with Indian sounds gave the album a new texture. But the imbalance remained 2 or 3 George songs compared to a flood of Lennon-McCartney material. For George, the message was clear: his work was valued, but only in small doses. That inequality built up inside him year after year. By 1968, when the Beatles recorded the sprawling White Album, tensions were explosive. The sessions dragged on endlessly, with members often recording separately. George's "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" became one of the standout tracks, but only after he brought in Eric Clapton to play the famous solo. It was George's quiet rebellion. He needed outside validation to prove what his bandmates sometimes refused to see: his songs were world-class. The breaking point came in January 1969 during the filming of Let It Be at Twickenham Studios. Paul McCartney, ever the perfectionist, tried to direct George's guitar parts with painstaking detail. Cameras even caught the moment when George, exhausted and exasperated, snapped, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to." Days later, he walked out of the band entirely. For 12 days, the Beatles were reduced to 3. George's departure shocked everyone. It was proof that the quiet Beatle had finally had enough. He returned only after negotiations and compromises, but the dynamic had shifted. George was no longer content to quietly submit. By the time of Abbey Road in late 1969, he came armed with songs that rivaled, even surpassed, Lennon and McCartney. Something, a tender ballad, that Frank Sinatra would later call the greatest love song of the past 50 years. And Here Comes the Sun, a song of hope written in Eric Clapton's garden, were undeniable masterpieces. For the first time, George Harrison stood on equal footing with the two giants who had overshadowed him for so long. Even Paul McCartney privately admitted the truth. In a candid remark later documented, he told John Lennon that George's songs were now at least as good as ours. But the acknowledgement came late. After years of George being dismissed or sidelined, the resentment was already set in stone. George had proven himself, but the scars of years of underestimation didn't fade. The Abbey Road sessions became both triumph and tragedy for George. On one hand, it was his greatest moment within the Beatles, 2 songs that cemented his legacy forever. On the other, it highlighted the futility of his struggle. Even at the peak of his creativity, he was still fighting for space on albums dominated by Lennon and McCartney. The imbalance never truly disappeared. In many ways, George's brilliance on Abbey Road was the final straw. It showed him, and the world, that he didn't need the Beatles to be great. He had more songs, more ideas, more creativity than the band could ever contain. The quiet Beatle had finally roared, and the sound of it marked the beginning of the end. Out of all the Beatles, George Harrison's most complicated relationship was with Paul McCartney. They met as boys, riding the same bus to school, bonding over chords and cheap guitars. Paul often referred to George as his baby brother, and in the early days that closeness defined their friendship. But as the Beatles grew, so did the imbalance. Paul became the band's most dominant creative force, driving sessions, shaping arrangements, and dictating direction. For George, who longed for space to develop as a songwriter, Paul's intensity often felt suffocating. One of the clearest examples came during the Let It Be sessions in January 1969. The cameras rolled as Paul meticulously instructed George on what and how to play. George's frustration boiled over in a now famous exchange. I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to, whatever it is that will please you." His tone wasn't angry, it was weary. Years of feeling like Paul's junior partner had reached a breaking point. That moment revealed the heart of their tension. Paul saw himself as the leader, while George wanted to be heard as an equal. George later admitted that Paul's perfectionism had stifled his growth. In one interview, he bluntly said, "Paul ruined me as a guitar player." To him, Paul's habit of micromanaging not only robbed him of confidence, but also reduced his contributions to mere background work. He respected Paul's brilliance as a bassist and songwriter, but he couldn't tolerate the way Paul dismissed his ideas. Harrison once confessed that he could join a band with John any day, but he could never be in a band with Paul again. That line cut deep, showing just how fractured their bond had become. Paul, for his part, later admitted that he had underestimated George. In a 2000 interview with Howard Stern, he reflected, "It was easy to underestimate George because me and John had always written most of the stuff." He called George a late bloomer, someone who didn't initially care much about songwriting but eventually produced some of the greatest Beatles tracks of all time. The acknowledgement was honest, but it came decades too late for George, who had already carried the sting of being overlooked throughout his career. In the studio, the contrast between their approaches often widened the rift. Paul loved control, detail, and precision. George valued freedom, space, and collaboration. On songs like Maxwell's Silver Hammer, George openly mocked Paul's insistence on endless takes, calling the tracks so fruity and a waste of time. To him, Paul's obsession with his own material highlighted the selfishness that George felt defined their working relationship. Paul always had 10 songs ready. George was lucky if 2 of his made it onto a record. And yet, for all the bitterness, their relationship was never simple. It wasn't pure rivalry. Beneath the frustration was love, history, and a bond forged in the fires of Beatlemania. George once said, "Whatever we've been through, there's always been something that's tied us together." Even as they clashed, that tether remained. It made their fight sharper, but it also meant reconciliation was always possible. By the 1970s, George's solo success with All Things Must Pass proved what he had always known. His talent was equal to Paul's and John's, but the wounds lingered. Every Beatles fan who hoped for a full reunion after Lennon's death in 1980 was confronted with the same truth. George and Paul's fractured partnership stood as one of the greatest obstacles. Theirs was a relationship that swung between brotherhood and bitterness, creativity and competition. George resented Paul's dominance, but he also knew that without him, the Beatles would never have existed in the same way. It was the paradox of their connection, too close to break, too fraught to ever fully heal. For years, fans assumed George Harrison's deepest frustration lay with Paul McCartney, and in many ways, that was true. But behind the constant clashes with Paul was a darker, quieter bitterness, one that George rarely spoke of, yet carried with him until the end. The man George Harrison truly resented, perhaps more than anyone else in his life, was John Lennon. In the early days, their bond seemed unshakable. George admired John. He looked up to him as the older, sharper, rebellious leader of the band. Lennon's wit, his charisma, his creative daring, all of it inspired George. When George was still the quiet schoolboy tagging along, it was John who ultimately allowed him into the Quarrymen. That decision changed George's life. For a time, the younger guitarist saw Lennon as both mentor and friend. But admiration soon gave way to resentment. As the Beatles soared, John's dismissive streak grew sharper. George's songwriting contributions were often belittled, brushed aside, or outright ignored. While Lennon and McCartney were granted endless space for their material, George's songs were treated as afterthoughts. The imbalance wasn't just practical, it was personal. John rarely took George's growth seriously, and George felt the sting of that disrespect more deeply than he let on. Lennon also mocked what George held sacred. When Harrison discovered Indian music and spirituality, it became the defining passion of his life. Through Ravi Shankar, meditation, and Eastern philosophy, George found purpose beyond fame. Yet John often ridiculed it. To Lennon it was pretentious. To George it was insulting. What he saw as his spiritual awakening, Lennon saw as a fad to be joked about. That divide drove a wedge between them that never fully healed. By the late 1960s, as the Beatles unraveled, the coldness between them was undeniable. Paul might have dominated the studio, but John's detachment cut George even deeper. Lennon was increasingly absent, either consumed by his relationship with Yoko Ono or disillusioned with the band altogether. When he did engage, it was often with sarcasm or indifference toward George's songs. George noticed. He later admitted that John rarely offered support, and when he did, it often came too late. Perhaps the most telling detail is what George didn't say. In his memoir, I, Me, Mine, he wrote extensively about his music, his influences, his journey. But he barely mentioned John Lennon at all. The silence spoke louder than words. It was as if George had erased him, unable or unwilling to revisit the wounds. Even after Lennon's shocking death in 1980, George's tributes were restrained. He mourned him, yes, but never sugarcoated their fractured bond. He admitted John could be difficult, selfish, and hard to love. For George, those scars were too deep to cover with nostalgia. Fans often wondered how George could forgive Paul, at least partially, but never John. The answer lies in the nature of their bonds. With Paul there was brotherhood, collaboration, and a lifetime of shared history, even if it was painful. With John there was admiration that soured into betrayal. Lennon had once been the figure George admired most, and perhaps that is why the bitterness cut so deep. He never forgot the sting of being dismissed by the man he once called a friend. In the end, George Harrison's true grudge wasn't the loud public rivalry the world expected. It was the quiet, private resentment that simmered between him and John Lennon, and though George rarely spoke of it directly, the absence of warmth in his words left no doubt. Behind the peace signs, the chants of Hare Krishna, and the image of serenity, George Harrison carried a wound that time never healed. By the late 1990s, George Harrison had lived many lives: the quiet Beatle, the seeker of spiritual truth, the reluctant star, and the man overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney. Yet even as his music and philosophy continued to inspire millions, his health began to fail. In 1998, doctors discovered throat cancer, the legacy of years of heavy smoking. He underwent surgery, but the reprieve was temporary. Within 3 years, cancer spread to his lungs and brain. By 2001, George knew his time was short. In those final years, a surprising turn came in his relationship with Paul McCartney. The rift that had defined so much of their partnership softened. In February 2001, less than a year before George's death, Paul visited him during treatment in New York. Later, Paul recalled sitting by George's side, holding his hand, and joking about silly things, just like boys again. It was a moment of reconciliation, proof that whatever bitterness had existed, the bond between them ran deeper than resentment. Paul would later call him my baby brother, words that revealed the love that had never truly disappeared. Their reunion echoed something George himself had admitted years earlier: no matter what the Beatles endured, there was always something tying them together. They had shared a journey no one else on earth could understand. Even when it was fractured, it was unbreakable. Paul's tribute after George's death in November 2001 was tender and heartfelt, calling him a lovely guy, a brave man, with a wonderful sense of humor. For all their quarrels, George left this world with Paul's respect intact. Yet the same could not be said of John Lennon. George had mourned him privately after 1980, but the wounds remained visible even in silence. In his later interviews, George rarely mentioned John at all, and when pressed, He spoke of Lennon as difficult, selfish, and dismissive. The lack of warmth revealed the depth of the bitterness. For George, that bond had broken long before Lennon's death, and it never healed. Still, George's legacy extended far beyond his resentments. His marriage to Olivia Arias, which began in 1978, endured until his death. Their son, Donnie, became not only his pride but also his living legacy. Olivia stood by George through illness, even protecting him during a terrifying home invasion in 1999, when she fought off an intruder who nearly killed him. Theirs was a love defined by resilience, and after George's passing, Olivia became the guardian of his memory. Donnie too carried the torch. He honored his father's music, performed his songs, and worked alongside Paul's daughter Stella in ways that showed a new generation of Beatles children building the bridges their fathers sometimes could not. Stella designed Donnie's wife's wedding dress. Donnie performed tributes at Stella's events. The next generation proved what the older one often struggled to show, that love and connection endured, even when their fathers' relationships had been marked by tension. Tributes poured in after George's passing. In 2004, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. In 2009, a star was unveiled on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. In 2011, Martin Scorsese's Living in the Material World documentary gave fans a glimpse of the man behind the music. Even decades after his death, blue plaques, statues, and murals have honored him across the world, from Liverpool to Bangladesh. George Harrison's final days revealed both the contradictions and the beauty of his life. He never escaped the scars left by John Lennon, and his struggles with Paul McCartney shaped his creative journey. Yet he also found peace, love, and spiritual meaning that reached far beyond fame. To the world, he was the quiet Beatle. To those who knew him best, he was the one who searched hardest for truth, and left behind a legacy that outshone even the bitterness he carried. George Harrison's story was never simple. To the world, he was the quiet Beatle, the thoughtful one, content to stand in the shadows. But behind the calm exterior lived a man constantly fighting to be heard. From the streets of Liverpool to the heights of Abbey Road, George battled not only for recognition as a songwriter, but for respect as a person. His rift with Paul McCartney was painful, defined by years of creative clashes and misunderstandings. Yet in the end, love resurfaced. Paul held his hand in George's final days, proving that brotherhood survived where rivalry once ruled. But his bitterness toward John Lennon never faded. The friend he once admired had become the figure he could never forgive, leaving a wound that time and even death could not heal. Still, George's legacy rises above resentment. Through Something, Here Comes the Sun, and a lifetime of spiritual searching, he gave the world music that endures far beyond the quarrels of the Beatles. His life reminds us that even within the greatest band in history, love and rivalry coexisted side by side. And it was in that tension that George Harrison found his truth. For more emotional stories, check out this video.